Our reading this morning is 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 10. If you want to look in your pew Bible, it's on page 966. For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith and not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please Him, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one of us may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. May God add His blessing to the reading of His word this morning.
How many of you like to read mystery novels or watch mystery movies, mysteries on TV? Any of you like those? How many of you like to try and figure out the mysteries read along? Is that something that you do? Okay. I do the same thing. And I got to be honest, most mystery stories tend to frustrate me because the authors often have the tendency to introduce elements at the very end of the story that I, as a reader or a watcher, would have no way of knowing previously. Because I like to figure the mysteries out and play along with it as it goes along, those surprise solutions are, to me, they're cheats. They're cheating because they're not giving me all the information. They don't allow me to come to the solution of the mystery because they hold that last key element to the end. I hate that. You hate that? I hate that. And it might seem contradictory in some way, but I do like stories that have a few twists and turns in them. I actually prefer a bit of the unexpected rather than just a straightforward telling of an account because it keeps things interesting. We have one of those accounts in the judge cycle that we have before us today. The account's filled with dramatic irony and filled with counter-turns and things that aren't always as they first seem that to be. But as we look at the account, as we open it up in Judges chapter 4, we see that the account starts just as we would expect it to, according to the formula that we saw in chapter 2. Israel relapsed into apostasy as once again the divine victory of Ehud over Eglon had not served to alter their deeply rooted tendency toward paganism, so they just lapsed into their old ways. And really, it's an unfortunate fact that security often leads God's people to respond not with loyalty, but with apathy toward God. The more comfortable we get, the less we seem to care. And as a result, we see Israel again begin to engage in behavior that was evil in the sight of the Lord. And accordingly, just as we've seen in the previous two cycles, and the pattern that was laid out for us, God remains faithful to His covenant promise, and He sends an oppressor to punish Israel. In this case, God's agent of punishment was Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. And we're told, seemingly incidentally, that the commanding general of his army was a man named Sisera from Harosheth Hagoyim. Sisera isn't a Canaanite name, so that may mean that he was a foreign mercenary who was hired by Jabin to command his troops. And if that's correct, it really does serve to show the power and influence that Jabin had if he was able to attract a foreign general to lead his forces. And we're told that Jabin was able to thoroughly oppress Israel because Sisera's forces included 900 iron chariots. The chariots were irony, by the way. Irony abounds in this case. And just as we saw in Judges 1:19, the existence of iron chariots tended to frustrate the Israelites because they could conceive of no way to defeat them. With their forces being on the ground, they saw no way to defeat an iron chariot. And the truth is, they couldn't defeat them in their own strength. They were outmatched. Militarily, they couldn't defeat them in their own strength. So because the Lord had left them to fight their own battles as a result of their compromise with the Canaanites, as we saw in chapter 2, verse 3, Jabin was able to oppress the Israelites using those chariots. And oppress them he did. For 20 years, he oppressed them before the people cried out to the Lord in pain, prompting God to provide them with a deliverer once again. So far, everything that we've seen here in this account fits neatly into the formula that we were provided. But from here on, there's very, very little that's going to go the way we expect it to, as the twists and turns abound in this account, and once more, treachery is going to play a crucial role in Israel's delivery. So let's turn our attention to God's provision of a deliverer as we look at the call of Barak, as we find it in verses 4 through 10. In the first two judge cycles, we see the provision of a deliverer is stated very, very simply. In the case of Othniel, the first judge, we read, "The Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel." Pretty plain statement. And in the case of Ehud, we read, "The Lord raised up for them a deliverer." Again, another statement, both simple statements of fact. But the call of Barak is quite a bit more involved. And we're first introduced to Deborah, who acts as God's agent in the call of Barak. And in verse 4, we learn three things about Deborah. First, we learn that she was a prophetess, she was a wife, and she was a judge of Israel. Being a prophetess certainly would make Deborah special, but she was far from unique. She joins in with the ranks of Miriam, who was the sister to Moses and Aaron. She was said to be a prophetess. Also Huldah, the wife of Shalom, is said to be a prophetess. And Noadiah is a prophetess, all three from the Old Testament. So she joins with at least the ranks of those three women. We also see prophetesses in the New Testament, namely Anna, the daughter of Phanuel. And we see the four daughters of Philip were all said to be prophetesses. And we see a false prophetess named Jezebel in Revelation 2. Well, the role of a prophet is first and foremost to be a spokesperson for God to the people. And whatever else is revealed about Deborah here, she is first and foremost a prophetess who speaks and acts on God's behalf. But she's also a judge, as we're told that she was judging Israel at that time. And as I said in one of the introductory sermons, she was probably the closest thing to what we think of as a judge today in our modern thinking. She probably comes the closest. But her being the judge in this case has the effect of catching the reader off guard, because we've come to expect a male to be named as deliverer. That's been the case up to this point. So we're left to determine what exactly the author means when he says that Deborah was judging Israel and sitting under a specific palm tree while the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. What exactly is going on there? Well, the best sense, I believe, is that the people were coming to her to settle disputes. When they had a problem, when they had an issue with one another that they couldn't solve on their own, they came to her for the answer. And remember, she was a prophetess. She was speaking on God's behalf, so they trusted her to give them the right answer. But they weren't coming to her for deliverance. They were coming to her to settle disputes. They were looking to Deborah to give them the divine answers to their legal disputes. And they came to her because she was a prophetess who was capable of arbitrating the matters that were brought before her in a God-honoring way. However, it's not the rendering of decisions on personal matters that we have before us in verse 5. That's not what the children of Israel were doing. What we have in view here is that the people of Israel came to her for a very particular judgment. The judgment, if you will. They were looking for an answer to a specific problem. And verse 5 really here is a continuation of the people crying out to the Lord. The people were coming before Deborah to discover what would God's response be to their cries of pain. That's what they were asking her to determine. That's the reason God caused the author to record the otherwise extraneous information regarding her judging activities, because they play no other part in this. That understanding becomes apparent as we focus, as the focus in verse 6 shifts from Deborah, who served as the medium through whom the Israelites seek God's answer, to Barak. And we discover that Barak is who God has actually appointed to solve the crisis, to be the deliverer. So the people come to Deborah for an answer from God, and in response, Deborah sends for Barak. She heard from God, she sent for Barak, and when he arrives, she either pronounces God's call upon him or confirms it with him. We could really read that either way. Either she's telling him something he didn't know, or she's confirming what he had already heard but hadn't acted on yet. And I think it's more likely the latter. She was confirming God's call upon him, that he had already heard it, and we're going to see why in a minute. I believe Barak had already heard God's call, but he hadn't acted on it, and Deborah summoned him so that she can confirm it. And my reason for thinking that way will be revealed when we see how Barak responds to Deborah, because he doesn't respond as we would expect. So Deborah issues God's challenge to Barak, and it's to go and rally and deploy 10,000 troops from Naphtali and Zebulun from Mount Tabor. He was supposed to bring them to Mount Tabor and launch an attack from there. And Mount Tabor was located at one of the most critical crossroads in the region, so that militarily would make a lot of sense. Then she went on to reveal that God would deploy Sisera and all his forces, including the chariots, against Barak and his troops, and give them into Barak's hands. So we see here that God is behind the scenes. He's ordering Barak to rally his troops and to bring them into attack, and he's also causing Sisera to respond so that the battle can take place. So we see God first sell Israel into the hand of their oppressor, and then orchestrate the oppressor's defeat when his people cry out in pain. And in verse 8, we come across another twist. The one I told you about just a minute ago. Barak is reluctant to answer God's call. Let's look at verse 8 together and see what Barak's response was. He says, Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." That verse shouldn't be there. That verse shouldn't be in Scripture. The narrative should have proceeded directly from verse 8 to verse 10, from God's call to Barak's obedience. That's the way it should have gone. But instead we see Barak hesitate and vacillate as he puts a condition on his obedience. The condition he places on his obedience makes him look weak and cowardly. He won't comply unless Deborah is at his side holding his hand. Makes him look kind of weak, doesn't it? That may not be the correct conclusion for us to draw. Barak might only be acknowledging Deborah's status here. And his request for God's prophet to accompany him might just be an appeal for the assurance of God's presence and activity in the doing of this thing. And he won't be the only judge to seek such an assurance. We're going to see other judges need to be repeatedly assured that God is going to do what he says he will do. So it may not be weakness, it may just be that he wants assurance. But either way, Deborah agrees to go along. And her assent occurs right at the point in the narrative where we would expect God himself to promise his personal presence based on the other narratives that we see in Judges. So apparently, Deborah serves as God's proxy in this case. And her presence alone is enough to get Barak to obey and to achieve his God-ordained victory over Sisera. And Deborah reinforces God's commitment by giving Barak a rather ironic guarantee, one that forces Barak to step out in faith, because he will only know for sure that God has acted on his behalf after the battle. The sign that is going to assure Barak that God has indeed called him, that God has indeed intervened, that God has indeed given him the victory, is that Barak and his troops will be victorious, but Barak won't get the glory, because God is going to sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. The obvious impression that we as the readers are left with is that the woman who's going to get the glory is Deborah, because she'll be there. As the call of Barak comes to a close, we see that Deborah's mission has been successful. So let's recap what's happened so far. The people of Israel have come to Deborah to seek an answer from God concerning their oppression by King Jabin. Deborah inquired of God and received word from God, and she sends for Barak to come to her. Barak responds by coming to Deborah under the palm tree, and after they converse, he returns home accompanied by Deborah. Then he summons the men of Zebulun and Naphtali, and when he does so, a force of 10,000 troops assemble at Mount Tabor. And the reluctant general has been successfully commissioned, and the army is standing assembled. So let's look at the battle and the military victory that we anticipate. Well, based on the two judge cycles we've seen so far, the reader would expect, again, a very short account retelling a swift and decisive victory, even though somehow the victory will go to Deborah. That would be our expectation. That's what we've seen so far. But remember, this account's full of twists and turns, so we're soon going to find that both of those expectations are mistaken expectations. The account of the conflict is unexpectedly long, and it begins with what appears to be an irrelevant interjection about a man named Heber the Kenite, who's described as a nomad and a loner. Seems that Heber the Kenite had moved as far away as he could get and had pitched his tent in a specific spot near a place called Kadesh. Now, if this is the same Kadesh as Barak's home of Kadesh Naphtali, Heber the Kenite may well have been the informer who let Sisera know that Barak had amassed troops and that they were headed for Mount Tabor. He may have seen all this activity and told Jabin what was going on. The sense of this detail might have been a lot more evident to the original audience than it is to us, I'm not sure. But what we do know is that God doesn't include these kinds of details for no reason. We're going to discover why this information is here when we get all the way to the end of the account. But regardless of whom it was that told Sisera about Barak's troop movement, when he heard, he called out his chariots and all his troops, and he mobilized them in response to the news, and thus we see that God has set the stage for the showdown to come. He has called out Sisera's army. When all the pieces were in place, God signaled the moment of action by giving the attack signal through Deborah and assuring victory to Barak, who responded by charging down Mount Tabor with his troops behind him. Then we come to verse 15, and in verse 15 we're going to see is the key to the entire account that is related in this chapter. Verse 15 says, "And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword." We need to pause here. We need to pause and recognize that despite there being 10,000 Israelite troops on the battlefield, God was the one who caused Sisera's contingent of chariots and all his troops to panic and flee from the battle. The Hebrew word here for our English word routed means to throw into confusion and cause motion. And it's God who caused the confusion. It's God who caused Sisera's troops to flee from the battlefield in disarray. This isn't the last time that we're going to see this motif in the book of Judges, where God secures a great victory over a formidable opposing force despite a reluctant and timid leader. We want to be very careful to note it because it shows us that God isn't limited by the quality of the instruments at hand, as long as those instruments are willing to be used. Then, sensing that the battle was out of hand, Sisera leaps from his chariot and flees on foot. But Barak, whose primary concern was the fleeing chariots and the army, he pursued the chariots and the army all the way to Sisera's headquarters in Harosheth Hagoyim, and he didn't stop his attack until all of Sisera's men had been slaughtered. We might reasonably suppose that Barak took Deborah's assurance at the start of the battle as a reversal of her earlier pronouncement that God was going to give Sisera into the hands of a woman. And maybe, just maybe, God was going to give Sisera into his hands after all. But after pursuing Sisera's army all the way back to their base, he came up empty-handed. Because Sisera wasn't with his troops. He had fled away separately on foot, a fact that was unnoticed by Barak in all the confusion. Now, if this was a made-for-TV drama, this would be the point where we went to commercial break and left the cliffhanger there for a little while longer. Sisera's successful escape has resulted in a complication, and it leaves us wondering how God is going to work through Deborah, how his word is going to be fulfilled. And if this were a made-for-TV drama, the show would come back from the commercial break, and we would see Deborah in hot pursuit of Sisera, while Barak chased down the troops and dallied over there. But as we read on, we discover that after her announcement that God was about to deliver Sisera into Barak's hand, Deborah has disappeared from the narrative. She's gone entirely. We don't hear her name mentioned again. And the plot slows down once more to follow Sisera's flight. So let's turn our attention to the flight and the eventual slaying of Sisera. Look with me at verse 17, where the author focuses on Sisera and also introduces a second woman to the narrative, a woman named Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, from verse 11. We can only speculate as to how much time has elapsed since Sisera escaped in verse 15, and between that event and his arrival at Jael's tent. All we're told is that Sisera is exhausted when he arrives. He's been running for his life, and he's worn out. And it makes perfect sense that Sisera would flee toward the camp of Heber the Kenite, because as verse 17 tells us, Heber the Kenite had entered into an alliance with Sisera's boss, Jabin. The word peace here translates the Hebrew word shalom, which indicates more than just an absence of hostility between these two men. Shalom is more of a covenant term that indicates friendly relations, perhaps even being formalized by a treaty. So Sisera would naturally feel safe in heading there, and he expected to be welcomed and shielded when he got there. And the original readers would have understood that Heber posed a double threat to Israel. Not only had Heber separated himself from the main clan of the Kenites and gotten as far away from him as he could, and the Kenites were Israel's allies, so he separated himself from their allies, but he's also bound himself by treaty to their enemy. So he poses a double threat. And the original reader would have understood that according to political and ethical standards, Sisera should have found safe harbor there. However, that isn't going to be the case, as Jael comes on the scene and takes complete control of the ensuing events. The author relates in verse 18 that Jael comes out to meet Sisera and takes the initiative to speak to him. She invites him into her tent, where she covers him with a rug. And she does all this before Sisera even utters a word. Jael's words were very soothing. She said, "Turn aside, my Lord. Turn aside to me. Do not be afraid." And those words would have served to assure Sisera that he was safe in doing what she invited him to do. And Sisera is lulled into what may prove to be a false sense of security, or what will prove to be a false sense of security, as he innocently enters her tent. He lays down and permits Jael to cover him what was likely a very heavy covering of some kind, likely a sheepskin rug or a goatskin rug, something thick and heavy that would conceal him well. Then in verse 19, we see Sisera, now safely concealed in Jael's tent, finally speak. And he asks her for a drink of water to quench his very understandable thirst after running away. And why exactly Jael retakes the initiative by substituting milk for requested water is a matter of scholarly debate. We just don't know. Some people speculate that she did so, she gave him milk to induce sleep. Some say that it may be part of the whole mothering motif in the entire account we have before us. We'll see more about that next week when we look at the second part. However, since God didn't choose to reveal Jael's motive here, we have to put her reasoning in the unknown column. He asked for water, she gave him milk. But we see her movements related in rapid-fire succession as if she was in a rush to get him back under concealment as quickly as she could. Then in verse 20, we see Sisera issue his final command. Sisera was a military commander. He was used to giving orders. And the language that he uses here is partially obscured in many of our English translations, including our own ESV. What Sisera actually says here is, stand at the opening of the tent, and if any man comes and asks you, is any man in here, say no. It's a subtle difference that we could easily read right past, and it's a subtle thing that happens here, but we need to slow down. We need to recognize the implication of what Sisera has just said. He's just impugned the character of Jael. He implied that some random man was going to come along and suspect that she had a man in her tent, that she was being unfaithful to her husband at a time when marital unfaithfulness would mean her death. He was basically calling her a loose woman. And even if it was unintentional, that was a slander that wouldn't have passed unnoticed back in those days. And I don't intend to imply that this was Jael's motive, that this is what motivated her to do what she did, but it couldn't have helped the situation. You can imagine her looking back over her shoulder and getting a wry smile on her face as she carries out her treachery. Talk that way about me, will you? Little did Sisera realize that in ordering Jael to answer with an absolute negation, there is no one here, he was prescribing what he was just about to become, a nobody. Transition to verse 21 describes in all its brutality. Treacherous nature of what Jael proceeds to do is highlighted by the author's inclusion of the words, the wife of Heber, after her name. It was ultimate treachery. And we read that Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and a hammer in her hand and crept up on the sleeping Sisera, and then she drove the tent peg through his skull, pinning him to the ground by his head. It's at this point that God's pronouncement through Deborah that the glory would go to a woman comes to fruition. Just isn't the woman we expected. And in verse 22, Barak, who we weren't even aware was chasing Sisera, arrives belatedly on the scene to discover the same truth. I want you to imagine his humiliation. Here he's just experienced a complete victory over Sisera's fearsome chariots and his whole army of foot soldiers, and having come to recognize that Sisera had escaped his grasp, he hotly pursued him, and he pursued just as hotly the glory that would come from killing him. He had visions, I'm sure, of grandeur, only to have Jael emerge from her tent and speak to him much the same as she had spoken to Sisera, and as she invited him into her tent with the promise of showing him the man he was seeking. Jael here is fully aware of Barak's agenda, but he's ignorant of hers. And you can just imagine him undoubtedly expecting to find Sisera cowering in the corner and easy prey for the slaughter. You can just easily picture him bursting through the tent flaps with his sword drawn, only to have his balloon burst when he saw Sisera pinned to the ground with a tent peg through his skull. The glory he was chasing, despite God's pronouncement, is finally and irretrievably lost to him. And in the final act of irony, God has fulfilled Deborah's prophecy and given the glory to a woman. God has given Sisera into Barak's hand, while at the same time he's also given the glory for Sisera's death to a woman, the woman Jael. Still, as in all these cases, lest the true hero of the account be overlooked, we read in verse 23 that it was God who subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. This reminds us once more that the conflict in Judges isn't actually between humans. It's not between the people involved at all. It's between God and the forces of darkness. Still, the commentary included in the closing verses of the chapter shows us that there's a joint effort here between the divine and the human as God works through his people to further his will. We read that God subdued Jabin before the people of Israel, while the people of Israel at the same time kept the pressure on until they destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. But in the final analysis, salvation is from the Lord. Like the account of Ehud, this account raises many issues, not the least of which is what should we think of Jael? Is she a heroine or a traitor? She's obviously an instrument that God uses, but does that mean that God approves of her methods? I believe the conclusion we came to when we studied Ehud is active here as well. And that's that sometimes the tools available for God's use are crude tools. The people God uses are not always noble in their actions, but God can still further his will through them. We have to always be mindful of what the Bible reports and what it recommends. We can't confuse those two things. Sometimes the Bible reports what happened without approving of it. In this account, we see the continual downward trend in the quality of deliverers. Othniel, remember Othniel? He was portrayed as exemplary, wasn't he? There wasn't a negative thing said about him. While Ehud was a far more ambiguous deliverer, but he was still really a solo hero. He took out Eglon on his own. He took great risk and handled that himself. And now we see that Barak was a reluctant recruit. And we see that it took an entire army and 2 women to fulfill the human role of God's plan to deliver Israel. And yet God alone still sits at the top as he executes his plan. What can we learn from the people in this account? Well, in the case of Barak, we see the consequence of being hesitant to engage in God's work, something we need to think about as God's people. God apparently meant to bless Barak, but Barak forfeited that blessing by putting conditions on his participation. There's undoubtedly a lesson here for us, and really all of God's people, as God's blessings are often given according to the extent of our faith. And faith, remember, is a verb. It's not a noun. It's demonstrated when we put our trust into action. When we put the things we say we trust in into action and demonstrate our trust, that's faith. And how God blesses us is often according to how much faith we exhibit. Jael, on the other hand, doesn't seem to be inhibited at all. The action she carries out is somewhat surprising, considering all that she had to lose by breaking the treaty her husband had entered into with Jabin. Think about that. She didn't just wasn't treacherous against Sisera, she was treacherous against her own husband. Consider the potential wrath she would face when this came to light, and the possible loss of reward that they might have experienced if they had protected Sisera. You can't help but wonder what exactly motivated her to do what she did. We're not told. Nothing in our text indicates that Jael was particularly spiritually minded. There's no explicit statement of her having a relationship with God. In fact, God is never mentioned in connection with Jael at all. She just shows up and does the dirty deed. Nothing in our text indicates that she had God in mind as she did it. And while Jael received accolades aplenty, we're going to see, we'll see all that next week. Her honor seems to have been limited to the human plane. We don't know if she is now enjoying peace with God today. We don't know. We're not told. All we know is that she was blessed in this life, while Barak was bereft in this life because of their respective receptivity to God's agenda. Deborah alone, in this whole account, seems to maintain respectability. But despite the efforts of some modern feminist theologians to transform her into a feminist hero that was out against the patriarchy, Deborah isn't the point of the account. We're not supposed to come away from this account, having read it, marveling about Deborah and seeking to be a Deborah, except perhaps to the extent that she maintained an openness and a willingness to play her part in God's work. The ultimate lesson that we need to take from this account concerns God. The love for his people that God has. God's faithfulness to his covenant promises. God's working in the world to bring about his ends. Those are the things that we need to notice. Because those things are still in force today. No matter how bad things around us might seem. No matter how irony the chariots against us may appear. No matter how fallible and weak God's people might be, God is still sovereign, and his plans will not be thwarted. That's a reason for God's people to persevere to the end and to celebrate along the way. That's what we should take from this. And celebration is what's on the agenda for next week. Next week we're going to be looking at Judges chapter 5. And in these two chapters, chapter 4 and 5, we have the privilege of viewing the exact same event through two different lenses. And that's going to allow us the opportunity to gain some insight into Hebrew literature. Because Judges chapter 4, as we just looked at, was rendered in prose. It was just a prose narrative. But Judges 5 is going to look at the exact same event through the eyes of poetry. We're going to see how the two things compare. So as you prepare for next Sunday, read through Judges 5, make note of the differences that you find between the two literary forms, and make note of any questions that those differences raise in your minds, because I'm sure that they will, because they're two completely different tellings of the same event. That's what's on track for next week. So let's pray, shall we? Father, we ask that, unlike Barak, you would make us sensitive to your guidance. You would make us obedient to your direction in our lives so that we might take full advantage of the blessings that you have for us in this life. We ask you would help us to remember the fact that even though we often feel inadequate or unsuited for the task that you have for us, you alone are responsible for the outcome. You only ask us to be faithful in the doing. Father, we rejoice in knowing that you are always faithful to your covenant promises and faithful to your people. That you are all powerful and that you remain in control of everything that goes on. We ask you to give us the ability to persevere to the end of our lives. We pray all this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.